A single whispered word could get you killed here. Not shouted, not screamed, whispered, and that was enough. On this island, silence was not a virtue. Silence was the law, and breaking that law brought a punishment so severe, so absolute, that no one who witnessed it ever spoke of it again. For generations, an isolated community on a forgotten coastline lived under one unbreakable rule: never speak after dark. Not your name, not a warning, not even a prayer whispered for the dying. Those who did vanished. No trial, no explanation, just gone by morning, as if the island itself had opened up and swallowed them whole. Sailors who anchored offshore described a village of silence, children who never cried, elders who never sang, entire families communicating only through gestures and coded taps against wood. Visitors assumed the population was mute. They were not mute. They were terrified. Terrified of something buried so deep in the island's past that even now, generations later, the descendants of these people refuse to speak its name. Today, we break that silence. We expose the forbidden rule that turned an entire community into prisoners of their own. Fear and the unimaginable truth they were forced to protect at any cost. What could possibly be worth this much terror? Worth silencing an entire people for 200 years? To understand the silence, you have to understand the island itself. Picture a rock barely 3 miles wide, battered by relentless Atlantic winds, cut off from the mainland for months at a time, by storms that made crossing the water a death sentence. No roads reached it. No government truly governed it. For nearly 200 years, this island existed in its own closed world, its own rules, its own punishments, its own God. The families who settled there were fishermen and outcasts, people who had nowhere else to go. And in a place with no law enforcement, no courts, and no outside witnesses, the community built something far more effective than any legal system: fear. Elders passed down a set of unbreakable commandments, spoken only once to each child, at night, in private. Speak after sundown, and you invite the listener from the sea. Light a fire past midnight, and you call something ashore that should never be named. Question the elders in public, and you vanish before the tide turns. Nobody knew exactly who, or what, enforced these rules. Some said it was superstition, a story invented to keep children obedient. Others insisted it was real, that they had seen shapes moving along the cliffs on moonless nights, waiting. But here is what should have been impossible. Island records, recovered decades later from a collapsed church cellar, hidden behind a false wall no one had touched in generations, revealed something no one expected. The rules didn't exist to protect the villagers from a monster at all. They existed to hide one, a monster with a very human face. The cellar records, written in cramped, frightened handwriting, told a different story than the legends. Decades before the island's strict laws were enforced, a sickness had swept through the settlement, a fever that spread fastest through sound. Coughing, screaming, crying out in pain, the dying moaned through the night, and within weeks, entire households were wiped out. The elders who survived reached a horrifying conclusion. Noise was killing them faster than the disease itself, because noise brought neighbors close enough to catch it. So they made a choice that would define the island for 2 centuries. They didn't just quarantine the sick, they silenced everyone, permanently, as policy. Rules were framed as sacred law, enforced by an invented listener from the sea, because fear of the supernatural controlled people more completely than any human authority ever could. Every disappearance attributed to this creature was, according to the buried records, actually the elders themselves, removing the sick, the noisy, the disobedient, and anyone who threatened to expose the truth. Here is the detail that changes everything. The sickness had ended within a single generation. The island was safe again within 20 years. but the silence never stopped. Because by then, the rule of silence wasn't protecting anyone from disease anymore. It was protecting the power of the elders who enforced it, men who had discovered that a terrified, silent population was easier to control than a healthy, speaking one. Children were born, raised, and buried under a law built from a lie their own ancestors had long forgotten was ever a lie at all. An entire community silenced for a plague that no longer existed, simply because silence had become useful to the people in charge. Think about that for a moment. Generations of people whispering in the dark, terrified of a monster that was never real, obeying men who let them believe it, long after the true danger had disappeared entirely. When the records finally surfaced, decades after the last elder who enforced the old laws had died, the reaction on the island was not relief, it was grief. Grief for parents who had vanished under a rule that was never sacred. Grief for children punished, isolated, or cast out for the crime of speaking too loudly in their own homes. Grief for an entire way of life built on a foundation of manufactured fear. There was no dramatic trial, no public reckoning. The men responsible for enforcing the silence generations earlier were long dead, buried under the same cliffs where their victims had vanished. Justice, in the traditional sense, never came. The island's descendants were left instead with something harder to carry. The knowledge that their families had suffered for nothing, obeyed a lie for nothing, buried loved ones for nothing. Some islanders left the moment the truth came out, unable to remain somewhere so soaked in invented terror. Others stayed, determined to finally speak freely in a place that had punished speech for 200 years. And this is why it still matters today. Because this story was never really about one island. It's about how easily fear can be manufactured and maintained long after the original threat is gone. How those in power can keep entire communities silent, obedient, and afraid, simply because silence benefits them. Look around. Ask yourself how many rules you follow without ever questioning where they came from, or who benefits from your silence. Even now, in a world that thinks itself far too modern for such things, this forgotten island didn't just lose its voice. It lost the truth, buried under its own fear, for 200 years, and it almost lost it forever, if not for a handful of yellowed pages nearly destroyed in a collapsing cellar wall. History rarely repeats with monsters. It repeats with silence. Every generation believes its fears are ancient, sacred, unquestionable, until someone finally asks why. This island teaches us that the most dangerous rule is not the one written in law, but the one whispered into a child's ear at night and never explained. Power does not always announce itself with cruelty. Sometimes it simply asks you to stay quiet, and lets fear do the rest. The forbidden truth this island buried for 2 centuries was never a creature from the sea. It was the terrifying ease with which silence can be manufactured, inherited, and mistaken for tradition. So, before you close this video, ask yourself, what silences have you inherited without ever questioning where they came from? And whose fear are you really carrying? Tell us what you think really enforced the rules on that island in the comments below. And if this forgotten history unsettled you as much as it unsettled us to uncover it, subscribe, because the darkest stories are the ones no one was ever supposed to tell.